Hey class, I hope you guys are enjoying the studies in this semester as much as I have been and have been encouraged as we've journeyed through church history 2 together. I have the privilege of also, in addition, walking through the book, The Life and Diaries of David Brainerd. He was produced by Jonathan Edwards, the famous Puritan theologian, as we've read of already in our class during the period of the Great Awakening. It is the most sold of all of Jonathan Edwards' books, even among Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, The Freedom of the Will, and even Religious Affections. Is often used as a means of study and encouragement for those going into the mission field, and has been now for going on over 250 years since its time of writing. This book and the diaries were not initially desired to be published by David Brainerd. He actually desired that they would be kept for himself, not as a means of selfishness or not wanting to produce his writings in that way, but because he wanted no one to view him in the sense that he would have something of value. The thing that was most valuable to David was God, and he certainly didn't want to be a distraction from those things. But due to his young age, sought to not have his works published, but due to passing away from tuberculosis at 29, nearing the end of his death, Jonathan Edwards actually was given permission to publish his works, which we are very grateful for, and I have been richly blessed myself from his writings. I've been inspired from his writings for a multitude of reasons. I'll admit that I haven't spent a great deal of time considering overseas missions. As you know, if you know anything about David Brainerd, that's what he's primarily known for, to evangelizing Eastern Native Americans during the period of the Great Awakening. So this book has been of encouragement to me for the sake that this hasn't been a topic that I've thought a lot about. And I've been very grateful for that. So with that in mind, this book is, again, written by Jonathan Edwards, but it primarily composes the works of David Brainerd. So we have a preface that Jonathan writes and explains of the means of encouragement he received from David, but further he gives commentary throughout the book as well. David's father and mother passed away at an unfortunate young age. By age 14, he was without parents. He was born in April 20th of 1718. Experienced great hardship. His family, both physically and mentally. He speaks of his disease of melancholy. And spoke of great deep sorrow of and for God, especially in his younger years. Legalism was his relationship with God. It was high demand. He didn't know how to love a God that he couldn't follow his commands. He deeply struggled with his assurance and was concerned of his sin and his love for God. So David spent a good deal of his time really leading up until the point that he turned 21 and became a believer, of dealing with this difficulty of knowing God but not really knowing God. His knowledge of God was one of do this, and if you don't, then you may not enter the kingdom of heaven. So as a result, he spent a good time in his diary actually writing about his deep affection of sin. He had a high view of sin, which in some regard makes sense given his relationship with Jonathan Edwards. As we've been reading in our class about Reformed theology, sin is certainly prevalent to the world, so much so that we believe in total depravity. And this wasn't lost on David. David struggled deeply with his sin, pleading that God would take him away because with him being alive, he was too much full of sin and would never be without sin, and was concerned as a result that God may not enter him into the kingdom of heaven. David finally gives his life to God again, as I mentioned, at age 21. Before he actually understands who God is, he actually gives his life to him. So he inherits a farm at age 19. and eventually at age 21 deciding that he would go to Yale, but prior to this decided that he would actually give his life to God. But many would record that he doesn't actually know who God is yet by what we would consider a spiritual conversion to be. So with that in mind, he actually gives his life to him before having life in him. And I think this is primarily back to his legalism. I think that he struggled deeply with appeasing God. And one of the things that we tend to do when we have this kind of mindset is, one, we struggle with our own sin. It's obviously the thing that's most apparent. But secondly, we try to find a way to appease it. It is the gospel message. But one of the aspects is self-righteousness, or trying to do good in order to appease the wrath that God has for us. And this wrath wasn't something that David was unaware of. He was actually probably more aware of it than most of even our own sin today. So with these things in mind, there is a point where, thankfully, God saves David Brainerd. And he finally reaches his point of conversion. And I had to write this down from his diary and pull it straight from the book. I just thought that it was so great. And I'm kind of paraphrasing just to get more information without spending a great deal of time. But he writes, "It was a new inward apprehension of you, such as I never had before. I stood still, wondered, and admired. It was wildly different than any apprehension I had about God. It appeared to be divine glory that I beheld, and I was inwardly satisfied that he should be God and ruler of all forever and ever. Thus God I trust." One of the sweetest things about reading this book specifically for my own faith has been watching David's develop. He starts the book in his diary, obviously feeling deep wrath from God, to this point of being overly satisfied with him. So much that I think it drives him actually to being the primary reason that he is known for the missionary that he is today. David saw his life after his point of conversion as not one that was his, but it was God's. And just think about this. David was 21 years old at the time of his conversion, but yet passed at 29. And in those 8 years, we account for one of the greatest missionaries that ever lived. So what a work that God had done through David in such a short time. And the reason why I also bring that up is because for some of us, we hit this point of conversion, and sure, our lives ought to look differently. For some of us, sanctification happens slower than others. But for David, it was quite quick. And praise be to God for that. David felt a great sense of nearness to the Savior, and what he ultimately was captivated by was divine glory, as what I mentioned in this quote. And divine glory for David was the sweetness of evangelism. He wanted others to know God as he had experienced him, especially coming from the other side of legalism. So one of the things contextually that we consider is thinking of David's life. So one of the main themes that we understand a lot is suffering. Of course, David was sanctified over the course of specifically those 8 years, but leading up to that and even past, David experienced a great deal of sorrow, which again he relates in his form of melancholy. And even so much so that he was actually removed from Yale. So remember, he devotes his life to God, and that could seem quite distant whenever the means in which you plan to devote your life is no longer there. But David was faithful to press forward. He didn't stop when suffering came. Rather, he viewed that as another way to draw nearer to God, and he pressed into that. And that's something I think that we can value from his faith. David, in his prayer, he quotes that he never felt as sweet at times as the times that he got to intercede for fellow non-believers in prayer. Again, this entire life that he has derives to this point of evangelism. We know him as a missionary, and this is the type of love that he had for God, is that he would experience his time in prayer, interceding for others is the greatest moment and point of it. And David has a funny life in this sense. He's both pleading for God to come back because he's still aware of his sin. This hasn't been forgotten by David just because he hid salvation. He still took this very seriously. And actually, one of the things that I was most encouraged by was the great time that he spent with God in prayer. he certainly wasn't willing to do this life on his own, and that was quite encouraging to see how many times he would just spend fasting and praying for a day at a time. There would be times where he would write an entire day worth of account just by what he had experienced during prayer. And yeah, that was a great deal of encouragement to me in my own spiritual life. So with all these things in mind, we think, how does this contextually deal with the people of his time, right? So one of the major ways is that this wasn't something that we just account for 250 years from now. Guys like William Carey, Jim Elliot, Jonathan Edwards, certainly having such a desire to publish his works, were greatly impacted and encouraged. So remember the scope of how this fits into the rest of the class. So we're in the middle of the Great Awakening. The movement of the gospel is seemingly more clear to the culture than what it may have ever been to some people's lives, and David Brainerd is certainly a part of that. He's evangelizing to the Eastern American Indians, spending a great deal of time interceding for prayer, and guys that we look to like William Carey are encouraged by his faith. David certainly, again, wasn't willing to just stop at what was right in front of him. Rather, he went all in. He was willing to live anywhere, be anywhere, do anything. He just wanted to exalt the ruler. And one thing that's ironic is nearing the time of his death at age 29, David actually writes in his journal near page 278 that he actually pleads for death. He experiences hardship, again going back to that central theme of his life. And ultimately what David is praying for is that he would die. He wants to be with Christ. And he ultimately sees his sin. He knows that this can't be all that the world has for him and that the Lord would have for him. And as a result, wants Christ. So I think this is just a cool paradox that we see. We obviously have a responsibility to be an instrument, as David was for the Lord, but yet all along realizing even these joys are blimps in what we'll receive in eternity with Christ. And I just found that to be also another reason to be encouraged by his writings in his book. And I'm very thankful that he gave Jonathan Edwards the permission to publish it because we've reaped great joy from it. I'm noticing I'm going far beyond my time here, and I just want to summarize by this. David, again, as we've already kind of touched on, has this theme of suffering, tribulation in life, dies at a young age 29, and ultimately is sold out to the Lord in the simplest way that you can put it. And I think the things that we can take away from this, especially as we've talked this week, kind of looked ahead before recording this, the Great Awakening, and what would that look like for a second one of those to come into the United States. And I think it's just faithful men like this. I'm so encouraged by his time in prayer, his love for God, and ultimately this is something that we all trust in God for. But I certainly think guys like David Brainerd are a really good place to start. And contextually in his time, with the challenges and just some of the sin of Indians selling land for things such as alcohol and gaining debts, and a lot of the struggles that we actually deal with to not such a degree in those terms, but just in sinfulness in the world, I think was prevalent for David too. So I think that we can take heart, we can be encouraged, know that the Lord is faithful, and know ultimately that Christ's kingdom will come to fruition. And I pray that David's story would one day be our story, to which places that do not yet have a church history might have one through our faithful evangelism and also our faithful love and servanthood to the Lord. Thank you guys, and hope that you will pick up this book and check it out and be blessed by it, just like I have.